welcome to 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. I'm your host, Rachel Vogel, and joining us for tonight's episode is Jamie Krents, Executive Vice President and Head of Verve, Impulse, and Verve Forecast Records. With over 20 years of experience, Jamie has worked with an iconic and diverse group of artists, including Kurt Vile, Rod Stewart, Mary J. Blige, and most recently, Jon Batiste, who landed 11 Grammy nominations at this year's show and took home 5 awards, including the coveted Album of the Year for his record, We Are. And when he's not busy being an executive, Jamie's an in-demand bass player who's recorded, performed, and shared the stage with acts like the French Kicks and Karen O. So without further ado, Jamie, how are you? Thanks so much for being here.
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I think in-demand bass player, that we may need to update that. I don't know that that's necessarily still so true, but everything else I think was pretty accurate. No, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So imagine for a second you're sitting down with your 25-year-old self. What's one piece of advice you would give to him on a personal note? And what's one piece of advice you would give him from a business perspective?
I think amazingly, I was already working at Verve when I was 25.
Wow.
I know it is hard for some people to believe now, especially because I think people of younger generations change jobs much more frequently. Other than being a bass player, I've only had one real job, if this is a real job. But I think on the personal level, I would probably tell that person, don't fixate so much on getting fired. You know, when I started working in the record industry, it was right around the time of Napster and, you know, trading hard drives and downloading music. And there was a lot of restructuring and downsizing. It was kind of constant at the time. And so there was so much effort and energy put into worrying about job security. And I think what I would have said to that person is, that person being me, you know, don't worry about that so much. There are, you know, that there are lots of opportunities and you can't really control a lot of that anyway, and just worry about your reputation and doing right by your artists. I think I more or less came to that conclusion organically, but not when I was 25. I think when I was 25, I was still terrified that one day I'd come in and my card key wouldn't work,
right,
or that my email address wouldn't be valid anymore.
I can relate to that.
Sure, I mean, we all can. But the reality is that nobody gets into the music business because it's the most stable or conservative or predictable thing. That's what's so cool about it. It's a dynamic business that we work in. It's creative. We work with artists. There's a lot of unpredictable, spontaneous things that happen. And I think that probably would have been advice that would have been good for me to hear. I'm not sure I would have believed it, but here I am. And then on a business level, I think, you know, what I probably would have said to that person as well is just be very open-minded about opportunities that come along. You know, I had never left the country before I started working at Verve.
Oh, wow.
I was not from a family that had the means to travel internationally growing up. And I can't tell you how great it was for me to get a job, you know, at the bottom of the international department of Verve, and then kind of work my way through that and get to understand the nuances and the idiosyncrasies of all the different markets and territories. You know, we work in a very remote world now, and there's lots of Zooming, but there is no substitute for getting on a plane and walking around that city, going to a concert in a different city, going to a record store, you know, when that was happening, and just soaking up the things that make the industry different all over the world. And so I really would have told myself then, lean into that even more than you think is possible. It was the best thing for me. It gave me the best training for my ears as far as what's viable, or, you know, some things that are really viable domestically, but they aren't going to travel. And some things are really global, and working at a label like, you know, Verve's an eclectic label. And it was really valuable for me before I had the role I have now to do international, because it gave me the perspective to understand that, for a lot of the kinds of artists that we work with on Verve, it really only makes sense to work together if you can deliver an international career and international value for them. So
Absolutely.
international was like the greatest kind of boot camp finishing school. So I would have just told myself, don't hesitate to take that. I think I felt like an imposter when I started in that department because, I'd never even been to Canada. And so I think I felt like I was sort of fooling everybody for the first 2 years. But it was so good that I took that role and leaned into it and somehow survived. And
Yeah.
it really, really benefited me. Yeah.
Survived and thrived. Awesome. Yeah, it's funny you say the thing about feeling like an imposter because it's actually been a common topic in recent episodes that I've done. A lot of executives have said something similar. So I think that's important to note because a lot of people can feel that way when they're young and starting out.
Or not young.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Anytime, anywhere.
or right now.
Yeah,
right.
that is
Right.
true.
Right.
Right along to question number 2. Every industry has its dirty little secrets, and we both know that it's no different in the music industry. And sometimes people think that's a bad thing, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they're quite good. What's one secret you would like to share with our listeners about the industry?
It's a good question. I think that there's a little bit of a stigma on working at a record label. I think, going back to Spinal Tap, obviously there are the sort of parodies of what the guys and girls from the labels are like. And I laugh along with it, but I also remember thinking the same thing. I played in a band, actually, ironically, in a band that ended up on Universal. And I remember at the time having a lot of those preconceptions and then coming and working at a label at the same time. And for many years, I did both, where I was still playing in bands, but also working at a major label. I think that we don't do a good enough job of reminding people of why labels are still valid and valuable. And, there are no shortage of options now. Everyone with a laptop can make a record and release it. And I think there's a place for that. But I do think for the right artists, record labels of the scale that we have at Universal, like Verve, still are to me, they're peerless. I think we still do. So I actually think it's kind of a dirty little secret that working at a record label and record labels themselves still have a completely necessary value, and that's why I think you see that a lot of artists who might have the means to release their own music still want to work with labels because there is a lot that we bring to the table. And I feel like I still feel like it's these stereotypes that exist, but most of the people that I know in this building, I work in a building that has a lot of the Universal labels, and a lot of my counterparts at the other labels, like, they really love music. Ultimately, there's a lot of data, but we still, at the end of the day, go with our instincts and our ears more often than not. And I think also there's a real sense of community within this building, and within all the labels kind of have their own personality here. And Verve obviously has a very distinct history and kind of mission statement now, but I think you could say the same about the other labels in the building. And so I think, again, there's a little bit of they're sharks and they're, the record labels are just taking advantage of artists, but like, no one here, I can speak for the 40 some people, that I'm on a team with here at Verve. No one comes to work thinking about anything like that. We come to work thinking about how we can be additive and augment what these artists are doing. And I just think this idea that we're here to take advantage, or that we're not always thinking about how to be successful. We just want to win with these artists. It's really not about anything other than that. So working here has been a good eye opener that, that in fact, most people who work at record labels really want to help their artists.
For sure.
And they really like music. There were certainly more stable businesses to be in for the last 20 years than this, but unfortunately, I think I'm probably unemployable outside of this. So luckily I'm here, and hopefully I get to stay here.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's great. That's definitely a good point with the record labels and people. A lot of artists can do things independently, but there's definitely still a purpose and a need.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, look, it's great that there are options because there's more, again, when I was growing up, if you wanted to make a recording, you had to scrape together money to go to a studio and find, I mean, it was a lot more involved. And now, like I said, anybody with GarageBand or anyone with a phone can make a pretty decent sounding thing. But, and I think it's important that that's available to everybody all over the world. But at the same time, there are people who are really, really exceptionally talented, who just need help finding a bigger audience, and I think that's something that I think we're very good at, and I think especially as the pendulum has swung, between different genres of music, in popular music, a label like Verve stands out because what we do isn't really about chasing trends. I mean, obviously Jon Batiste has had a very good year and a half. And he's somebody who really, if he had gone and tried to fit into a template, it wouldn't have worked. He wanted to find a partner that could help amplify what he's doing, which is, very authentic to himself. And so I think, a lot of it for labels is also like work with the right artists because they'll make the label look good. And they do.
Right. Believe it or not, we're already at the third and final question. So throughout your career, I can only imagine that you've been asked a lot of questions, whether for industry conferences, the media, a promotion. But throughout all of those interviews and all of those questions, I'll bet there was one that you have never been asked but would have liked to. So what is that one question and what would have been your answer?
No, there are a couple that I could think of, but I'll limit it to one. I think a lot of people ask, or I think no one's ever asked me, but what I wish someone had asked me is why Verve? Why have you, I won't say chosen, but why have you ended up spending 20 plus years at this label, at one label, and why this one? And there's a couple answers to that. But I think that primarily, I grew up and I had a lot of Verve records. I played the bass and I wasn't ever a great jazz musician, but I studied jazz bass for a time in college and I played some jazz gigs, but I was always more of a rock musician and all the bands I was in were more like indie rock bands, but I always really loved jazz. And so when the opportunity came up, I started at Verve as a temp, actually, and I thought I'd be there. It was just between tours with my band, and I figured I'd be here for 2 or 3 weeks, and it would be
wild.
Cooler than, like painting houses or tending bar or something like that. But I was sort of fascinated by it as an opportunity because it was a label that had such an incredible history. I mean, I had Ella Fitzgerald albums and I had Billie Holiday records and Louis Armstrong and, and same thing with Impulse with Coltrane and Mingus and, Oliver Nelson and these kind of icons of jazz. And I think it was actually great for me to work here because I didn't really have dreams of being a jazz star. If anything, I was trying to make it as a rock musician. So there was a little bit of a separation between church and state, and so I was able to work here and never feel like, oh, it should be me on the other side of the glass. I never had any of that like bitterness or kind of feeling that I had underachieved or anything like that. So it was actually, but I could still relate to the artists and talk with them about what it's like to be in a van or on a bus and eat shitty food and all of that stuff. And so that's why I think Verve has ended up being the right place for me. It aligns really well with my tastes. I'm a big nerd about music. I have pretty eclectic tastes, but it also aligned with me, I think, in terms of how I could reconcile it with being a musician myself and still be additive without trying to step on all the artists' toes. I've never asked to be an executive producer on any of our artists' records. I don't really believe in that. I think for me, that's not the right choice. I'm here as a sounding board, but I'm also here mainly to help work. We have a really good A&R team. And I trust them and I work with them, but I also let them do what they do. And that way, I think our artists hopefully feel happy to be at a label where there's someone who has a past as a musician, but isn't trying to sneak in and play on their records or, anything like that. So we're able to kind of keep a good boundary there. So it's, that no one's ever asked me why Verve and why not Island or Colombia or,
Right.
places like that. But even, the few opportunities I've had over the years to, maybe look at another role somewhere else, I really identify with Verve. Verve started as an independent label for Ella Fitzgerald. Actually, her manager started it with her because she couldn't get the kind of record deal she wanted as a woman of color back then. And I like to think that Verve has retained that kind of spirit and bespoke sort of indie approach, but within the world's biggest music company. I think that there's a nice marriage of that kind of boutique thing, but also with
Hmm.
all the bells and whistles that come with being part of a really big global powerful network of international music people. And that's been really, really valuable for the artists who are on Verve. So I think for me, honestly, if someone had asked me that, I probably would have been happy to give that answer, and hopefully that wasn't too rambling, but
No
you know,
way.
yeah.
That's great. That's really good perspective. Well, Jamie, it has been wonderful having you on 3Q tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. And to all of my 3Q listeners, I know you enjoyed hearing from Jamie just as much as I enjoyed speaking with him. So stay tuned for next week's episode of 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. See you next time.